الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن سار على سبيله إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue to discuss in the book Bulugh Al-Maram min Adilat al-Ahkam by Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and we are covering Kitab Tayammum. So we have covered a few other hadith in this chapter, and today inshallah ta'ala we'll be continuing discussing other hadith in this particular chapter, and we try to cover what he mentioned, the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir. So this hadith would be one of those hadith that give us a description as to how one to perform a tayammum. So that hadith will be read, and then we go into discussing of the hadith in some detail bi'awnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Chapter 9, Bab al-Tayammum. Hadith narrated by Ammar ibn Yasir radiallahu anhu. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent me on an errand, then I became junub. I did not find water, so I rolled on the soil like an animal does. Then I returned to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and mentioned that to him. He sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "It would have been sufficient for you to do with your hands this way." He then struck his hands once on the soil, and then rubbed the left hand on the right hand and the exterior part of his palms and his face. Muttafaqun alayh, agreed upon. And this wording is Muslims. In a narration with Imam Al-Bukhari, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam struck the earth with his palms with both hands, and then blew off the dust and rubbed both of his palms over his face and hands.
So that's the hadith that is mentioned of the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir radiyallahu anhu, where the hadith he mentioned قال بعثني نبي عليه السلام في حاجة فأجنبت فلم أجد الماء فتمرغت في السعيد ثم تتمرغ كما تمرغ الدابة ثم أتيت النبي عليه السلام فذكرت ذلك له فقال إنما كان يكفيك أن تقول بيديك هكذا ثم ضرب بيديه على الأرض ضربة واحدة ثم مسح شمال على اليمين وظاهر كفيه ووجهه متفق عليه واللفظ للمسلم وفي رواية للبخاري وضرب بكفيه على الأرض ونفخ فيهما ثم مسح بهما وجهه وكفيه. So that's the hadith that is mentioned here by the author, that is to give us the hadith that will explain regarding, as the first time we have mentioned, Ammar ibn Yasir. So we'll mention something brief regarding Ammar ibn Yasir, then we go into a takhrij of the hadith by mentioning some of the sources of the hadith and also the wording of the hadith. Then we go into discussing matter pertaining to the ahkam that can be taken from the hadith, and also the mawdu of this hadith. So as for the first of those things that is mentioned, that were mentioned regarding something regarding the narrator who's Ammar ibn Yasir. So as mentioned here by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, when he mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith, that he mentioned something regarding Ammar ibn Yasir. So he mentioned that Ammar ibn Yasir, this narrator Sahabi, that his name is Ammar ibn Yasir ibn Amir al-Anasi. So Ammar ibn Yasir ibn Amir al-Anasi. And he mentioned as for his kunya Abu Yaqadhan. So his kunya Abu Yaqadhan, that's his kunya, Mawla, that one of the Mawla min Bani Makhzum. And he of those who accepted Islam early, in the early days, he accepted Islam. Also both his mother and father, so both his parents, mother and father, that they accepted Islam. And also as a family that they were punished. So in the early days, when Islam was weak, while in Mecca, that the Muslim, that they were being punished by the kuffar. So they were punished by the kuffar because of them accepting Islam. So amongst those that were punished is the family of Ali Yasir. Yasir. So they mentioned that they were punished by the mushrikeen while they were in the early days of Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ, even at time, the Prophet ﷺ, that even went by and saw them being punished. And in Mecca, فَيَقُولُ لَهُمْ, that he would say to them, Sabran ya Ali Yasir. So he mentioned when Ali Yasir going through the punishment from the kuffar, he mentioned to them, Sabran ya Ali Yasir. Inna mau'idukum al-jannah, that be patient, the family of Yasir, and also that your promise is Jannah, that your promise your promise is al-Jannah. So that hadith he mentioned here, that this hadith that mentioned it as Sheikh Albani, that he mentioned in the book in his Sirah, authenticate that narration. And also regarding Ammar ibn Yasir, of those who participated in many of the battles of the Prophet ﷺ, so he fought with the Prophet ﷺ in many of the battles, or all of the battles that he fought. And also that it is stated that Ali ibn Abi Talib that Ammar ibn Yasir, that he had words of praising regarding him. So overall, that it mentioned that he has hadith, that Ammar ibn Yasir also regarding a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ foretold that he will be killed, as mentioned, fiyatin baghiya, that he will be killed by the ones who are the transgressors. So a group of transgressors will be to want to kill him. And they stated that the ulama, that they're in agreement regarding ijmu ala annahu qutila mal Ali, that he was killed with Ali ibn Abi Talib fi Siffin. So both Ammar and also Ali, as both were on the same side. So Ammar ibn Yasir, he fought alongside with Ali ibn Abi Talib, and both were killed. And they mentioned that in Sana Sab'a wa Thalathin, in the 37th year of the Hijrah, that this battle of Siffin, it took place, and Ammar ibn Yasir, that he was killed. So concerning something brief regarding Ammar ibn Yasir, one of the Sahabi, al-Jalil. Then as for the next matter regarding al-Takhrij, so as for Takhrij of this hadith, that based upon what is mentioned by of those who have made tahqiq of the book of Bulugh Maram, that of them, that they have stated regarding this particular hadith, that hadith of two narration. The first narration, muttafaqun alayh. So the author, he mentioned the narration of muttafaqun alayh, but that narration of muttafaqun alayh, that narration is in the Muslim. So this narration is that of Muslim, as they mentioned here, walafli Muslim. Then he mentioned that وفي الرواية للبخاري, then a second narration, or the narration of Imam Bukhari, that a slight difference in wording. So that's concerned the wording of hadith. So as for the general takhrij of hadith, that is muttafaqun alayh, that it is stated at hadith that it can be found that in Sahih Bukhari and also Sahih Muslim, this hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir. So the hadith can be found in Sahih Bukhari, also in the Sahih of Imam Muslim, also in the Sunnah Abu Dawud, Nasa'i, Ahmed, Bayhaqi, Abu Awana, Ibn Ibn, Ibn Khuzaymah, and Daraqutni. So these are some of the sources I mentioned in the hadith. So and also Abdul Razak, Ibn Hibban, and so these are of those who have narrated this hadith. So again, they mention Abdul Razak in the Musannaf, Ahmed, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Nasa'i, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban, Daraqutni, Bayhaqi, of those who have narrated this hadith, and others. So that's concerning the source of the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir. So the narration that is mentioned here, as for and that's the wording of Imam Muslim. So the hadith muttafaqun alayh, mean the hadith is found in Bukhari and Muslim, but the wording that is mentioned here is close to that of Imam Muslim. As for the narration, the wording of Imam Bukhari, you mentioned وفي الرواية للبخاري, that as for this there's another narration, slight change, another narration of hadith, meaning that but this wording of that of Bukhari mentioned, as he states regarding وَضَرَبَ بِكَفَيْهِ أَرْض al-hadith. So they mentioned that narration that is mentioned, the second narration, that it can be found also in Abdul Razak, also it can be found Ahmed, Bukhari, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, Ibn Hibban, wa Daraqutni. So the second narration, that of the hadith, that is found in Abdul Razak. They mentioned that. They mentioned that we mentioned Abdul Razak as also that the hadith also is found the first narration of Bukhari and Muslim, not in Abdul Razak, but rather in Ibn Abi Shayba in his Musannif. So it's in Ibn Abi Shayba in his Musannif. As for the second narration of Bukhari, then that is the one that is found in Abdul Razak, and then it mentioned Ahmed, Bukhari, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, Ibn Hibban, Daraqutni, who have narrated the second narration of this particular hadith. So that's concerned the source of the hadith. So the hadith generally concerned the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, that a slight difference in the wording of the hadith. Will also add concern that in the hadith so that's concerned the hadith, a slight difference in the wording of the hadith found in Bukhari and Muslim. So that's concerning mention regarding Ammar ibn Yasir. Second, takhrij of the hadith, and to some extent. Then as for the next matter, which is regarding concerning mawdu of this hadith. As for the mawdu of this hadith, that hadith that they mentioned, that Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, that when he mentioned this particular hadith, that he mentioned it after the title was gotten, Bab or Bayan Kayfiyat at-Tayammum. So he mentioned that this hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir is a discuss that he mentioned here, Bayan Kayfiyati Tayammum. So how to go about performing a Tayammum. Then I mentioned أنه لا فرق بين الحدث الأكبر والأصغر, and also discuss regarding is there a difference regarding حدث الأكبر وحدث الأصغر, regarding major and minor impurities, that how does that relate to Tayammum. So regarding concerning, so that's the mawdu of this hadith. So in discussing concerning the masail of this particular hadith, there are many. So there's many things that can be taken from this particular hadith that have been mentioned here. So as for these ahkam, that the first, that from this particular hadith of Ammar, that it mentioned Ammar, that Ba'athani, the Prophet ﷺ sent him for a hajjah. So the Prophet ﷺ sent him out to do some type of, for some matters. Then on carrying out that matter, ajnabat. So he mentioned ajnabtu, that he felt in a state of janaba. So he felt in a state of janaba, so in a state of that, he required to perform major, a part of major impurities. So a state of major impurity. Then it mentioned regarding concerning falam ajid al-ma, that he mentioned, I did not find water. So he did not find water, but in a state of major impurities, as this particular hadith, it mentioned. So they said, as for the ahkam, that can be taken, that one, that tayammum min hadith al-asghar. So what's the ruling regarding the person performing tayammum while in the state of minor impurities? So the person in a state of minor impurities, that he required to perform wudu ordinarily, but because of not having access to water or having water, is he allowed to perform tayammum for removing of minor impurities? They mentioned here that An-Nawawi in his book Sharh al-Mu'adhib rahimahullah ta'ala, يجوز التيمم عن أذى الأصغر بالكتاب والسنة والإجماع. So the ulama, as stated by An-Nawawi, that the ulama are in agreement that the person is allowed to perform tayammum due to the reason of minor impurities. And that's agreed upon between the ulama based upon the book and the sunnah and ijma regarding to removing of minor impurities. So that's an ijma between the ulama. And as we had mentioned in the previous hadith, that it shows off this matter. So the previous hadith that we have mentioned are evidence for this. Then also they mentioned the next matter to be discussed, that tayammum and adath al-akbar, that a person in a state of major impurities. So one in a state of major impurity that is required to perform ghusl, is the person allowed to make tayammum for major impurities, hadath al-akbar. So on this matter, that they mentioned that based upon the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, that is mentioned, as I mentioned, فَأَجْنَبْتُ, that I was a state of janaba. Then it mentions, so they said, based upon this hadith, it shows the permissibility, jawaz, the permissibility for a person to perform tayammum to remove for the state of major impurities. So this hadith, it proves that it is something which is allowed for a person to perform tayammum to remove major impurities. So they mentioned regarding concerning, and it mentioned that so this hadith is a proof of that matter. And also they mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the ayah, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, if you does not find water, فَتَيَمُّمُ سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, that perform sa'idan tayyiba, and it is general. It doesn't make a distinction regarding major or minor. So it is general regarding the ruling that is applied. So that's it. Based upon this, it shows that it is allowed for the person in a state of major impurities that they can perform tayammum. So it's a major impurity. The person needs to perform ghusl, but cannot find water. So he make a tayammum, and this is something which is allowed. This is allowed. So on this matter, that they mentioned that you find that Jumhur of the Sahaba, wa Tabi'een, and Ammar, that they're of the view that this is something which is allowed. So Jumhur, Jamair, Al-Ulama min al-Sahaba, wa Tabi'een, wa Ammar, that came after them, of the position that one is allowed to perform Tayammum for removing major impurities. But I mentioned that an exception of some of the ulama, amongst those who does not take to that view, that they mention Omar ibn Khattab, also Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Ibrahim al-Nakhai. So those three of the ulama from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een that take the position that the person does not perform Tayammum in removing major impurities. Again, Umar al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, alayhim rahmatullahi ta'ala, jami'an, where they said, no, it's not allowed. And as mentioned by An-Nawawi in his book Al-Majmu'. So that's mentioned that they are of the view it is not allowed. They mentioned, as for the Athar, going back to Ibn Umar, to Umar al-Khattab and Abdullah bin Mas'ud as-Sahabiyan, that I mentioned that thabitan, that those ahadith, that they have mentioned that there's something which is thabit, that goes back to them. Even though Ibn Taymiyyah, so that's concerning that going back to them, but I mentioned that that they does not see this to be the case. Both that's in the hadith that is mentioned of Ammar somewhat, it directly discuss this matter, and a direct proof of this matter. So they mentioned that overall, that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ regarding that from the view that they have taken, that but overall regarding that, the overwhelming view is that tayammum is also is applied to and used in removing of major impurity. And Ibn Taymiyyah have mentioned that what have been stated upon Omar and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that they came back from that view. That they came back from a view based upon most of the text does not make a distinction. And also the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, also it proves that major impurity being done by way of removing of major impurity by way of tayammum. So that's concerning that matter. So overall, that they mentioned that for matters regarding major impurity, that a person is required to perform ghusl, and tayammum does not act as a substitute. But as I mentioned, so they mentioned that so overall regarding concerning the matter, that the ayat and ahadith, that they are more so in to their aid. And you have a further discussion regarding that matter between the ulama that goes into further detail regarding that discussion regarding of the evidence that is used by the ulama to say that so of those evidence that is used regarding, they mentioned that in the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 6, where they mentioned وَإِن كُنْتُمْ مَرْضَى أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ أَوْ جَاءَ أَحَدُكُمْ مِنْكُمْ مِنَ الْغَائِطِ. So they mentioned that, it mentioned that if any of you is ill, or you have come back from a journey, and if any of you have returned back from a journey, and is and mentioned min al-gha'it, and in a state where he have defecated, akramakumullah, regarding this matter, then it mentioned that أو لامستم النساء. So they mentioned that it shows regarding that tayammum is allowed regarding gha'it, which is minor impurities. Then also it mentioned indicating that also أو لامستم النساء, that if also لامستم النساء means that you have touched of woman. And they mentioned that of the Salaf, that they have mentioned regarding concerning Ibn Abbas, that what is meant by لامستم النساء, that it is al-jima, that this is intimacy, the person having intimacy. And it mentioned that فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَا, and you do not find مَا فَتَيَمُّمْ سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, then you should perform tayammum sa'idan tayyiba. So it proves regarding that tayammum can be used in the case of the person's state of major impurity and also minor impurity. And this ayah is a proof of this. This ayah is a proof of this. So they mentioned that in our qawl shad wa da'if in the regarding those who say that it is not. That says that so overall concerning, so that's the matter regarding that discussion that is mentioned by the ulama. Then also of the other matters that is discussed, that by the ulama regarding a tayammum, bima yasug tayammum, what's allowed for a person to use for tayammum. So it mentioned Sa'id and Tayyiba. So what is meant by this? It mentioned the hadith, regarding that, it mentioned in the hadith concerning that فَتَمَرَّقْتُ فِي السَّعِيدِ. So what is Sa'id? So he rolled himself in the dirt, his entire body in the dirt. So they mentioned that, what constitute Sa'id? What constitute a Sa'id? What is allowed for the person to perform, to make tayammum on? So they mentioned on this matter that of the aqwal of the ulama ala qawlain. So the aqwal of the ulama, they have two positions on this matter as to what constitute Sa'id. What constitute a Sa'id? So they mentioned regarding concerning the first opinion, أنه لا يجوز إلا بالتراب, that one is not allowed to use or to make tayammum except from turab, only from dirt. So the person only can make tayammum from the earth, from dirt. And that's the call that I mentioned here, the call of Imam Shafi, Ahmed, Ibn Mundhir, Dawood al-Zahiri. So they have the opinion that one is only allowed to make tayammum from the dirt itself, from dirt or the soil. That's the opinion taken by them. And they mention regarding concerning the evidence kind of somewhat what the ulama have used, those who are of this view, that is they mentioned that of the evidence also that they use as the evidence, the hadith of Hudayfa that I mentioned before, they mention ju'ilat li turbatuha lana tuhur, that they mentioned that the earth had been made for us pure. So they mentioned this meant the earth. So this meant the earth. So that is the thing, the only thing to be used for tayammum. So that's concerned, that's the view taken by, they mentioned here, some mention qawl akthar fuqaha, that akthar of the majority of the fuqaha, that they're more inclined or take the position that a person only use dirt for tayammum. Anything else, that it becomes not allowed. It is not to be done. As the Prophet mentioned, the hadith also mentioned ju'ilat al-turab li tuhuran. So I mentioned that it was made for me, the turab, the dirt, for me as something which is pure. So that's the dirt, they say, on the earth. So that's the call that is taken by some of the ulama. Another, and also they mentioned the hadith of Ammar that they use, they mentioned, that it mentioned that فَضَرَبَ بِيَدَيْهِ الْأَرْضِ ضَرْبَةً وَاحِدَةً, that the Prophet ﷺ, that he tapped the earth, strike the earth. So it mentioned that he strike the earth or the dirt or the dust. So based upon this, they mentioned that it showed that that is the thing to be used as for tayammum. The second opinion of the ulama, أنه يجوز بكل ما سعود على ظهر الأرض من التراب ورمل والحجر. The other opinion is that for tayammum, one can use anything that is on the face of the earth. That was said the thing that are, and I mentioned what meant by the first thing, that of dirt, the dust of the earth, or the dirt, also the stones of the earth, also the gravels. So things of that nature. So things of that nature, they meant that these things can be used as a form of purification, as a form of for tayammum. So they are more lenient when they mention things on the earth. So they're not restricted to them just to rub, but also the things of the earth, which are things that of these things that I've mentioned regarding al-hajar, stones, pebbles, and the likes. These are the things that can be used. And that's the view taken by Imam Malik, also Abu Hanifa, and a riwayah and Ahmed, and it's the view taken by Ibn Taymiyyah and also Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi. So they have the view that these other things is not restricted only to the dirt, but also stones and things of that nature also can be used. So they mentioned that as-Sa'id, that I mentioned that Sa'id, it means concerning كل ما ظهر على وجه الأرض, that all the things that's on the face of the earth. So Sa'id are those things that are on the face of the earth, regarding those things that are the natural stuff on the face of the earth. So the stone and the pebbles, rocks, and the likes, that these also are things that can be used for tayammum. So that's concerned the aqwal between the ulama, and it goes back and forth, but of those who are more inclined towards one of those aqwal, those who are more inclined towards the first opinion, and those that are inclined towards the second opinion. So those are the aqwal between the ulama on this matter. So you find that of the ulama mutaakhirin, that you find that more inclined towards the first opinion, which is that tayammum is to be done only on dirt. That they mention of those who are more in favor of that view, you have An-Nawawi, Shirazi, Khiraki, Ibn Qudama, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, Ibn Abdul Barr, Shams al-Haq, Azim al-Badi, Shawkani, and also they mention others of contemporaries. So that's concerning that matter. So the ulama, many of the major scholars of latter time that are more inclined towards the first opinion, and they mentioned An-Nawawi, Shirazi, Khiraki, Ibn Qudama, Ibn Rajab, Ibn Abdul Barr, Shams al-Din, Shams al-Haq, Azim Abadi, Shawkani, and the likes. So that's concerning the aqwal of the ulama between those two views. So the next of the opinion, the next of the matter that I discuss regarding this particular matter of a discussion of those who mentioned that if dust is on something, one can use dust. So that's of the opinion regarding the dust that may be found on something like, bookshelf on the wall and other things. If there's actually dust from the earth, that these things can be used. That of those who of that opinion. So that will go with the second opinion, that these dust that is found on these places, whether in the house or on the wall or on vehicles or the likes, then these can be used, included in those things, Sa'id. The ulama, they also add regarding concern is a turab that is used. They can also put a condition regarding a turab in whatever way that turab, that may condition, it must be ta'ir. So the turab that is used must be something which is pure. So turab, that's the condition that they have mentioned. So they mention in kana turab غير طاهر, if the turab is not pure, فلا يجوز تيمم به, is not allowed for one to make tayammum upon it. As mentioned, فَتَيَمُّمْ صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. So it mentions صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. So the person have to ensure that what is used as turab or that dirt, what is being used is something which is it is something which is pure. It is something which is pure. And next matter we'll find that the ulama have discussed. They mention حمل التراب في السفر, or even now a person who's even residential, that you have these turab that a person will walk with and use it in case they need to make tayammum. So the person is traveling or is residential. So you have these, so they mention regarding concerning of this matter that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned in the book اختيارات Ibn Taymiyyah, قال لا يستحب حمل التراب معه للتيمم. It's not something which is not mustahab. So that's something which is recommended. It's not something which is recommended nor encouraged for a person when he travels. Then he travel with some turab, he travel with some dirt, or he has this now whatever that is used today to travel with for tayammum. This is something which is not recommended. It is not recommended. Then I mention قاله طائفة من العلماء, but also you find a group of the ulama give some allowance. That he mentioned that some of the ulama have given allowance. Then he mentioned that Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali in his book Fath al-Bari, he mentioned قد استحب الثوري وأحمد حمل التراب للمسافر, that of those who give some permissibility of, they mention it is mustahab, istihbab or istahab, الثوري, Sufyan al-Thawri, وأحمد, for a person who is a traveler to take with him turab. So of the ulama who take this view. As they mentioned that, of the ulama who mention also that it is mustahab for a person to carry water with him if he's a traveler and he may need is to make wudu. So of the ulama that they mention من المتأخرين من أنكر وقال بدعة, but also you find a group of the ulama who came later that have taken a position, a person carrying water for tayammum on his journey or turab, they will have something which is they kind of that they denounce this practice and against this practice, and also they refer to it as an act of bid'ah. They see it as an act of البدع والله تعالى أعلم. So overall though, something which is لا دليل نزلتها that mentioned in the ulama of those aqwal. Those who say something which is not mustahab, those who say it is allowed mustahab, and those who say it's an act of bid'ah. And they denounce this practice. So for a person generally to leave this practice alone, for a person to leave of this practice and to make use of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have made available on his journey. As a person may travel, so that's concerning that particular matter. There's a matter regarding Tayammum, by way of his sifat, Tayammum. So of those things that are mentioned by the ulama regarding a Tayammum, that they mention of the aqwa of the matter which is discussed or mentioned in this discussion regarding Tayammum. Of those things that is mentioned, that they mention in Tayammum, al-ishtirat an-niyya li-tahara, li-tayammum, that the person, the form of Tayammum is required for the person to have a niyya. So a niyya is this one of the condition of while performing Tayammum. Should a person have a niyya? So on this matter, regarding the ulama, that of those who have mentioned that there's a khilaf between ulama on this matter regarding that stipulating or having as a criteria, condition, that Tayammum, does it require a niyya, an intention or not? So on this matter, that of the ulama who take the position that a niyya shart taharat al-ahdath kulla asghar wa akbar, that of the ulama who take the position that having an intention in performing of purification, whether for major impurities or minor impurity, that the person needs to have an intention. So performing a tayammum requires an intention, as it is an act of ibadah. So they mentioned that as an act of ibadah, all acts of ibadah require an intention, and they mentioned the first hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِنِيَّاتٍ, that actions are by intention, the famous hadith. So they said, no, all acts of ibadah requires an intention. And this would include tayammum, as a tayammum is an act of ibadah. So tayammum requires an intention. So that's the call taken by jumhur of the ulama. So jumhur of the ulama, that they stipulate that tayammum requires a niyyah, an intention. Then you find a view which is opposite this, that they say it does not. That it does not require an intention, and that qawl mansub ila zufr min Hanafiyya, that wal Awzahi, that I mentioned that a few of the ulama who take the position that tayammum does not require an intention. So there's no intention required. And of those who that said, of those who it is mentioned of this view, Zufar min Hanafiyya, Awza'i, and also Al-Hasan ibn As-Salih, Hasan ibn Salih, that of the ulama that take of this opinion. Then they mention that of those that make a distinction, and their view is, this is the third opinion, they mention that tahara with water, wudu, yajuz bighayr niyyah. So tahara bilma, purification with water, yajuz bighayr niyyah, that it is allowed without intention of, so meaning that the person is performing wudu or the person performing al-ghusl is not required to have an intention. Yajuz bighayri an-niyyah. So it is not a requirement for them for one to have an intention. According to this view, they mention وَلَا يُجْزِي تَيَمُّمْ إِلَّا بِالنِّيَّةِ. They mention that the second view they mention is that as for tayammum, it requires an intention. It requires an intention. So they make a distinction between tahara bilma and without water. So in the case of the person using of water for purification, it's not a requirement for them to have a niyyah. But for a person doing tayammum, is required to have an intention. And I mentioned that the qawl that is taken, that's qawl madhab al-Hanafiyya. That's the madhab of the Hanafiyya. وقال به Sufyan al-Thawri. So Sufyan al-Thawri and the Ahnaf, they make that distinction between using water is not required for intention. If you're not using water, tayammum, then you're required to have an intention. So that's concerning that discussion between that's the opinion between the ulama on that matter. And next of those matters that are discussed between the ulama, that from this particular hadith, that they mention tartib al-adha at-tayammum, regarding concerning that, the tartib, that the order in which the person perform tayammum. So which to be done first. So the tartib, as the other person, which act to be done first is wiping the face. So at tayammum, it requires, I will discuss in the next hadith, that the person, that the areas that are to be wiped is the face and the hands. So it mentioned regarding concerning the face and the hands are the areas to be wiped in tayammum only. So they mentioned regarding concerning of those two, and as the ayah have mentioned, famsahu biwujuhikum wa aydikum minhu. So it mentioned that the areas to be wiped based upon the ayah, it mentioned famsahu biwujuhikum, that you are to wipe your face, wa aydikum min, and your hands. So those are the two areas that the person wipe in performing tayammum. But as for does the person go according to that order, that sequence, the face, then the hands, that's a discussion now between the ulama. So on this matter, that they have mentioned regarding of the ulama, of those who mentioned that afdal, is it wajib for a person, that is of those who mentioned that you have aqwal on this matter, of those who mentioned that you have different aqwal, but they mentioned that afdal and tuqaddam mas al-wajh, that is better for a person to start first with his face, then his hands. And it said in sequence with the ayah mentioned wujuh, then it mentioned AD. So it mentioned wujuh, then AD. So they said based upon the ayah that a person go with the sequence of the ayah, which is face first, then the hands. So that's they mentioned that, but also they mentioned that, but jahiz is allowed for the person wants to do opposite the hands and the first, that's jaiz. So preferable to start with the face, then hands. But if the person wants to do the hands and the face, that's okay. That's still okay, and his wudu is still valid. And they mentioned here that the view of jumhur of the ulama. So whichever way, it's allowed, but one way is more recommended than the other, which is the face, then the hands. They mentioned concerning the hadith of Ammar, that is mentioned that in some of the narration, that the face is mentioned first, and then the hands. So, so it mentioned ثم ضرب بيديه على الأرض ضربة واحد ثم مسح الشمال على يمين. So it mentioned that it mentioned والظاهر كفيه ووجه. So the hadith Ammar, it mentioned the hands first, then the face. But the ayah mentioned the face, then the hand. So they mentioned that then also the next narration of Al-Bukhari mentioned ونفخ فيها ثم مسح بهما, يعني his hands, وجهه وكفيه. So it mentioned his face, then hands. So they mentioned that based upon this, that what is preferred is the face, then hands. But if the person was to start with his hands, then face, then it is still allowed. It is still allowed. So that's concerning. So based upon it, they mentioned it is not allowed, or that wajib for a person to stick to the tartib, or first face first and then hands. It is not a must, and that's with a discussion between ulama. But overall, prove that it is allowed. That it is allowed, and it's not wajib for a person, but it is mustahab to start with the face, then the hands. So tartib laysa wajib, but rather mustahab. also from the hadith, that in this particular hadith, that it mentioned that the amount of strike of the earth is once, with both hands. And that is used for both face and hands. So one strike, both hands striking the earth, and then the face and the hands are wiped. So as we'll discuss concerning, so you have that discussion, we'll discuss that further as the next hadith also, it mentioned that discussion. The next hadith, it mentioned that hadith. As for the next matter regarding in a person wiping off the face and the hands, to what portion to be wiped, what portion of the face to be wiped, and how much of the hands to be wiped. That I mentioned regarding concern as for the face, that it states regarding that the person ta'mim al-wajh wal kaffay, that a person which is up to the risk, that a person wipe up to it. It mentioned that the entire face to be wiped. So they mentioned that Ibn Rajab rahimahullah mentioned that ajmal ulama ala mas, that is agreed upon the ulama, mas al-wajh wal yadayn bit turab fi tayammum fard la bud min, that wiping the face and the hands, it is fard, it's a must. Then they disagree, you understand, regarding concern to what extent of the face to be wiped and the hands. Is it the entire face or most of it or a portion of it? Then that's the discussion between the ulama. So they discuss regarding what is said to be the to what extent is to be wiped. So on this matter, that they mentioned that as for the face, that ذهب Imam Malik وشافي أحمد والجمهور العلماء أنه يجب الاستيعاب, that it is compulsory a person to wipe his entire face بالتراب. So the person to wipe his entire face, that is wajib. With the back of, with the palm of his hand, with the palm of his hand, he wipe his entire face. That's the call taken by Jumhur of the ulama. Then Abu Hanifa have different riwayat. And Abu Hanifa, they mention he have different riwayat and Abu Hanifa. Where in some riwayat, he mentioned he agree with others that all the face to be wiped. In other narration, he mentioned that the person, that a majority to be done, where he mentioned that. Then you have others, so you have different narration of Abu Hanifa. Some mentioned the entire thing. Some mentioned that, he mentioned that mas akthar, that the person, that he wipe majority of his face. So that's concerning that view that is mentioned on Abu Hanifa, and others who are of that view. So of those who take the view that the person is required to wipe majority of his face, and that is sufficient, not per se the entire face to be wiped. Ibn Hazm and others, so you have of those who take a view of that majority, Ibn Hazm of those of that view, and also you have, they mention Sulaiman al-Hashimi, Muhammad ibn Maslama al-Maliki, Yahya ibn Yahya al-Nisaburi, and others who kind of somewhat take the view that, and Ibn Hazm amongst those, that they mentioned that, I mentioned famsahu. So they mentioned that al-mas doesn't include that something has to be, everything has to be done. So he mentioned that the word mas, it kind of somewhat what is taken from the word mas, it doesn't mean that the entire thing is wiped. So wiping mas doesn't mean the entire thing is tiab, but what it means that most or some of the face is wiped. So that's the discussion between the ulama on this matter, that it is mentioned by Ishaq ibn Rahuya, that he says, Yamur biyadayk, that a person should have both his hands to wipe ala jami' al-wajh, that both his hands, that it should go over the entire surface area of his face, wal lihyat, and his lihya, so all over the face, and his lihya here, asaba ma asab, whatever it touches, it touches. وأخطأ ما أخطأ. And whatever it missed, it missed. So he said generally, is Hakim Rahuya, that the person should place both his hands, move it over his entire surface of his face, and his beard, whatever area it did touch or it missed, then he mentioned that, then that is what is required. This is what is required to be done. So that's concerned the qawl that, so that qawl, Allahu Alam, seemed to be the more correct view, as stated by Ishaq ibn Rahuya, that the person wipe over his entire face area, whatever is touched, and whatever, if anything is missed, then it is missed. So that's concerning the view taken. They mentioned that if the person that and doesn't need to repeat, if something is missed, the person does not need to repeat back over is wiping off his face. And also they mentioned regarding concerning the and, the same discussion. The person that they mentioned Jumhur, the person wipe the back and said Zahir wal Batin, that they mentioned a person that as they mentioned here, Akthar al-ulama ala wujub mas al-kaffain, that majority of the ulama take the position that a person should wipe all that's compulsory to wipe over his kaffay up to his wrist. They mention zahiruhuma, the back, wa batinhuma, and the inside. So the back and the inside, the palm of his hand. So for the hand, the wiping is the back and the front. The back and the front. So that's concerning what is mentioned biturab ila qaw'aini, which is up to the wrist. So that's concerning the view that is taken by the ulama. So the same matter that is discussed regarding the face is the same matter regarding the hand. Is it all to be wiped? So they mention that Jumhur of the ulama take the position, and repeat this again, the person will do the back of the hand and also the palm of the hand, according to the view of Jumhur of the ulama on this matter. They discuss the matter regarding takhleel, and some even that a person takhleel bayna asabi, that the person need to go through his fingers, in between the fingers in performing tayammum. The ulama mentioned that's not the case. That there is nothing that is thabit on this matter by any nas regarding takhleel bayna asabi. There's some hadith I mentioned about for wudu, but that is not done, that there is nothing regarding tayammum regarding this matter. So based upon this, they said there's no nas, there's no text, nothing mentioned, so nothing to be done. So nothing, no qiyas between water and tayammum, as tayammum is to make something ease, is for ease. So the person does not apply qiyas in this case regarding wiping in between his fingers in performing a tayammum. The next matter discussed between the ulama regarding is the person wearing a ring in making tayammum. Is it to be removed or he can perform it with it on? Of those who mentioned that, as I mentioned, istiyad, the person has to remove his ring. And those who mention the person does not. So if it's something which is a small ring, Allahu Alam, if it's something which is a big ring, then it should be removed. If it's something which is small, then la bas. So that's concerning of those masail, some of the masail that relates to this discussion, some of the masail that relates to this matter. We'll end with this, as we're discussing concerning wudu, or tayammum, I will end with this matter is regarding, in discussing so as for all many times which you strike the earth, we'll discuss that in the next hadith and other matters. But as for the matter to end regarding sifatul tayammum, does the person say, is there anything to be said at the start of tayammum? So we had discussed previously in wudu, is there something to be said upon starting one wudu? I will mention you have some hadith regarding concern a person saying Bismillah in starting wudu. So does the same thing apply in tayammum? Does the same thing apply in tayammum? So as for those masala regarding the person, what to be said, is there a tasmiyah? Is it to be said in wudu? Then on this matter, there are the ulama who take the position regarding that a tasmiyah, regarding tayammum, that they discuss that it is something which is a sunnah. They mention that is a sunnah. So on the matter regarding a tasmiyah in tayammum, اختلف العلماء فيه أو فيها, of the ulama who mention هي sunnah. A tasmiyah sunnah in tayammum. And that's the call of Madhab of Hanafiya, Shafi'iyya, Riwayah and Ahmed, and also is the view taken by Ibn Qudama. So of those who say tasmiyah, saying Bismillah, in starting at the start of tayammum, it's a sunnah. Those of that view, the Hanafiya, the Shafi'iyya, Riwayah and Ahmed, and also the view of Ibn Qudama. And also another opinion, a second opinion, tasmiyah min fadail al-wudu. They mentioned that it's fadail al-wudu, and that's the call of the Malikiyya, the call of the Malikiyya. Opinion that mentions, a third opinion, la tushra, at-tasmiyah fil wudu, or in the sense, in wudu in tayammum, is not to be done in tayammum, is not to be done in tayammum. And of those who mean that, so you have that discussion in brief regarding it being something to be done or not to be done, based upon the view of the ulama regarding saying in wudu, regarding. So they mentioned regarding that, of those who say it is something to be done, it's a sunnah, that of the evidence that is used regarding those, it is mashru', it's allowed for a person to say Bismillah in performing tayammum, to say Bismillah. They use the hadith that I mentioned. They mentioned the hadith that it is stated, كل أمر أو كل كلام أو أمر ذي بال لا يفتى بذكر الله عز وجل فهو أبتر أو أقطع. I would know that hadith that the ulama discussed regarding that hadith, that hadithun daif. That hadith is regarding the hadith, meaning that any action of importance or speech that did not start with Bismillah, then it is something which is shortchanged or not valid or not recognized. So that's concerning what they use as their evidence regarding that matter. And also the famous hadith that they use with the hadith, they mention the hadith that the hadith, it states لا صلاة إلا بوضوء, that there is no salat except wudu. ولا wudu لمن لم يذكر اسم الله, and there is no wudu for one that did not mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name. That particular hadith have come by many sahabi, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, Abu Hurairah, Sal ibn Sa'd, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Sa'id ibn Zayd, Anas, Aisha, Rata'ala anhum ijma'in, that all those companions narrated hadith, but all the isnad, all those chains, they have weakness. So all those riwayat and all those companions, they are all weak individually. So all those narration, Abu Sa'id, Abu Hurairah, Sal ibn Sa'd, Ali, Sa'id ibn Zayd, Anas, Aisha, all of them individually are weak. Each of those narration on their own, going back to each of those Sahaba, it is weak. So the discussion between ulama is, do those narration all added together give strength to each other to raise the hadith to Hasan? So of those who take the position that all these asanid, when they are added together, that becomes solid ihtijaj. It becomes something that becomes something which is now a valid evidence, can be used as a source of evidence. Because of the all the narration being added together, it can give some indication that this can be used as an evidence or can be used as a source of proof. So those who made hadith is Hasan, and those who all the hadith still to be daif. So it goes back to that matter. Those who the hadith is Hasan, but they mentioned this hadith is regarding al-wudu. So they said that, so not per se matters regarding tayammum. So those who say, no, it is not mashru' for tayammum, because that hadith, if one were to say the hadith al-Hasan is maqbool, that's in regard to wudu. But not per se, the Prophet ﷺ in tayammum did not mention about Bismillah or mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name. So they said that, so that becomes the view of the ulama, that it is not mashru' for a person to do so. So they mentioned that there's nothing specific mentioned regarding this. So based upon this, it's not something which is mashru' until one can bring clear evidence that it is mashru'. So one has to bring evidence. So the asl of ibadat, al-hadar wa tawaqquf, that a person does not add or do anything until he has evidence. So there's no evidence regarding saying Bismillah in performing a tayammum. It is mentioned regarding matters of wudu with a discussion regarding that particular hadith. So that's concerning of those benefits that can be taken regarding different ahkam of that particular hadith. So as I mentioned, many various different many masail. Also from the hadith it shows regarding that وقوع الاجتهاد من الصحابة. That regarding concern is not ijtihad, that Ammar ibn Yasir, that when he took the act, that it was the state of janaba, he need to perform wudu, or need to perform some form of tahara. So what he did, he took the initiative of this act of rolling in the ground as a form of purification. Then the Prophet ﷺ corrected him. Then the Prophet ﷺ corrected to show that, that the Sahaba, even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that they did some act of ijtihad. But they will, in most cases, that they refer back to the Prophet ﷺ to get the correct answer or what was the correct thing to be done. And in this case, the Prophet ﷺ, he corrected him regarding what was the appropriate thing to be done. But the Sahaba, Ammar, he did ijtihad. He did a form of ijtihad. So it shows regarding a person making ijtihad in a situation where he need to do something, but for us, the general people, then we should go back. If we need to do something and we did take an action, then we should refer back to a person of ilm to see, was our action correct or not? Was our action correct or not? And the Prophet ﷺ, in this case, when Ammar did what he did not ask him to repeat his salat or the likes, or what came with it. He didn't ask him to repeat the act that came along with this. Also, as we had discussed, that with tayammum, the person is allowed to perform salat, read of Quran, and the likes. Anything that requires tahara, then he can do so at tawaf. All these acts that require tahara, tayammum, if done for its reason, then it serves as a form of purification for the person, and the person can perform any of these acts as required. In the next hadith, we will discuss certain matters that the ulama also include regarding this matter, that we'll mention it and end with this one. That if the person is without water, there's not water, and the person wants to have intimacy with his wife, but there's no water for him to make ghusl, is he allowed, knowing that situation, is he allowed to to have intimacy with his wife? So is a husband and wife able to have intimacy with the absence of water? Of the ulama mentioned no. And of the ulama mentioned it's allowed, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have given the person the option of tayammum. And we mentioned regarding concerning la mastum min nisa. That I mentioned la mastum min nisa, that in relation to al-jima. So if water is not there and the person performs jima, knowing that there's water, then he's allowed to perform tayammum, so he can do so. And there's no, some of the ulama mentioned, they mentioned that qawl, that there's no real dalil, that mentioned the person should wait, not have intimacy for 3 days. If after 3 days, then he's allowed. But before 3 days, he's not allowed. But they said there's no evidence to prove this. So, qawl al-rajah, regarding if the person want to have or intimacy being done in the absence of water, it is something which is allowed. And if they need to perform salah, then they just require to perform tayammum, that remove their impurity, and allow them to perform a salat and the likes. So we'll end with that particular matter. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهادي إلى السبيل والآخرة ورحمة العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.